Well, for more on how we got from fun leisure travel to over-tourism, I spoke with Jonathan Tourtellot, the founder and CEO of the Destination Stewardship Center. And I began by asking him about the double-edged sword for destinations that rely on tourism for their economy, only to end up being overwhelmed.
Well, one of the sayings is tourism is the fire that can cook your food or burn your house down, depending on how you manage it. When it gets to the stage of mass tourism, particularly if it hasn't been planned that way, the destination, and if you live there, that's your home, that's your place, the destination begins to lose its reputation. And it's like an old joke made by Yogi Berra, nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded. What that means is that the place is trading high volume for high quality. And there's a kind of decline in the quality and character of the place. And the trap, from the point of view of economic development, is that you end up, particularly with seaside resorts and whatnot, you end up offering the same thing that somebody else can offer cheaper. There's no distinction because you're catering to tourists that often literally do not care where they are, as long as they've got better weather than back home. And the same food and the same language. Spain is familiar with this kind of problem.
So then, to that point then, as we mentioned, it's the local residents who end up having to deal with the long-term damage once the crowds have gone. What sort of responsibility should fall on the tourists themselves and even the tour operators in trying to contain over-tourism?
There's two different answers to that question. For the tour operators, and some of them are getting more sensitive to this and even leading a charge for more responsible tourism, it's simply to design tours in such a way that they're not all hitting the same place at the same time and so on. For the tourist, for the traveler, and this is really a question for you as you're traveling, do you want to be just a tourist or do you want to be a real traveler? And that means being much more aware than we often are as to what's going on. First time I traveled around Europe, it was with a college friend, and he would joke as we were walking through the streets of Amsterdam, isn't it nice to have this city here just for our entertainment? He was making fun. But a lot of times, particularly first-time visitors, are not really thinking of how they fit into the place. And as soon as you arrive, you become part of that destination for the time you're there. What you do, how you spend, all of this makes a difference. And when you begin to think that way, the other stuff will fall in naturally. Don't throw trash in the streets. Think of what you spend as kind of a vote. I like this. And be interested in what the place has to offer that's different from what's back home.
Now, it's interesting because you've studied, in fact, you have the concept of geotourism. So talk a bit about that and how some of these destinations can strike that balance between wanting to have a booming business, but also being sustainable.
The geotourism concept I introduced through National Geographic when I was working there. And it is defined as tourism that sustains or enhances the geographical character of the place. And for people who live in countries where that term is used for geological tourism, that's a narrow part of it, but very compatible. But the idea is do tourism in a way that is sensitive to and even enhances the history you've got, the culture you've got, the type of cuisine you've got, the natural areas you've got, and most important, in a way that benefits local people. And working with that definition, you can do all sorts of wonderful things.
Now, let's also look at the number of Chinese tourists, obviously a big part of the travel market. In fact, by one count, Chinese tourists made a record 4.5 billion domestic and overseas trips last year, and that number is only expected to grow. And then you also have China as the top destination in Asia for visitor arrivals. How much of a game changer is China's contribution in Asian countries when it comes to this explosive growth we're seeing in tourism?
Well, China and the other Asian countries are a big contributor for the simple reason they've got a lot of people. And the good news is China and India are fairly roomy countries, so I think the ability to absorb the international traffic is not going to be terribly difficult. What's more difficult is absorbing the domestic traffic. And I believe just this year last, I forget which, the Taj Mahal began limiting the number of Indian tourists that could come, but not international tourists. And the reason for that is that international tourists generally spend more than domestic tourists. So it makes some sense to invite international in no matter what your country is. And when you yourself go overseas, look at what you do. You tend to spend more. It's your big trip. You're going to enjoy it. So that certainly has an impact.
And just lastly, talk about the role of technology in both helping promote tourism and then also how it kind of tips into over-tourism.
Well, I'll take that in reverse, because technology's role in over-tourism has been to make it a lot easier. And in some ways, that's good. And if you take something like Airbnb, for instance, there's a problem in that a lot of places are listed that aren't really home shares. They're rental companies masquerading as home shares. But the good thing about that sort of sharing economy is that it does disperse tourists throughout a city or throughout a region, and the tourist spending goes straight to the owner of the place. And if the host is there, they get to have an exchange. So there you've got good news and bad news right there. I think as we look in the future, we're going to see more places, particularly small attractions that are really stressed, start turning to virtual reality. If you don't really need to be there, here's a way you can experience it without having to go there. And we are already beginning to see places that are using tracking to begin to suggest, if you go to this section of town, you'll find it less crowded than if you go to this section, and begin to direct things that way. That can backfire too if everybody starts going to the back areas. But this is a balancing trick we've got to learn, and we've got to learn while tourism keeps soaring at a rapid rate.